All right, welcome to the last lecture on our introduction to metaphysics. In the last lecture, we talked about the power of will as an spontaneous non-causal power, and there we talked about spontaneity in the last video, how will can be a spontaneous power. The main objection was from determinism side, but we have dealt with determinism before. There's going to be another video also soon as one last shot at determinism. So today we'll go back to the other half of that claim, which is the non-causal part, where we said that will, when it is manifested as our volition, then we would have a non-causal power being manifested, and we will gain a second order power, which would be a causal power affecting our body. And one of the objections to that principle was the causal closure of the universe, trying to block a kind of mental causation. So our mental activities, such as our willing or volition, which is a mental event, cannot cause any physical change or any physical event. So today we'll look at causal closure, and if we get rid of that, then I believe we have a very good foundation for our free will. So just to recap, we are simple entities, metaphysically simple entities constituted by our bodies. Just a recap of our non-Cartesian dualism that we talked about, and also our simplicity. An interesting power that we have is our will, which is a spontaneous power, which means that it will happen whenever it happens. There's nothing before it's happening determines that it's going to happen, and that it is a non-causal power. The spontaneous part was answered by refuting determinism. The non-causal part we will do by refuting causal closure. So what is causal closure? So the argument that usually made to block mental causation has this general form. First, we start with the physical causal closure principle. So we just have a physical causal closure principle as our first premise. Then we say at least some mental events are causes of physical events. That's the claim that we have. Or we can say that for up to this point, we really don't know whether mental events and physical events are identical to each other. So we can easily say that everyone, even a physicalist, accepts this. The problem is whether mental events and physical events are different from each other. So this premise we agree with. Everyone agrees with that at least some mental events are causes of physical events. We decide to do something happens. Premise 3, the physical effects of mental causes are not in general causally overdetermined. So if an event has a cause, a sufficient cause, then it cannot have another cause in addition to that, because that cause was sufficient. So there's no overdetermination on it generally. There can be overdeterminations in reality, but this is not generally the way that it is. Therefore, at least some mental events are identical with physical events, right? If you put all of them together, that's the goal, to get to that conclusion. But of course, all of it depends on that first premise. What kind of causal closure principle should be put there that, along with the other premises, gives you that conclusion? Now, the interesting thing is that this causal closure one, even though it is talked about as if this very important principle, it doesn't have a certain clear, unified definition of exactly what it is. So there are different rendition of it. It can be, like I put 6 of them here. For example, all physical effects have sufficient physical causes. All physical effects have complete physical causes. These are different people who, I haven't put the sources, but different people, different philosophers put their own twist on it. So every physical effect has its chance fully determined by physical events alone. At every time at which any physical event has a cause, it has a sufficient physical cause. every physical effect has a fully revealing, purely physical history. No physical effect has a non-physical cause, etc., etc. So you can choose your own type. But the idea is that you have to have something like that in your first premise, and then you can get the argument going to the conclusion that mental events are identical to physical events. And of course, if that happens, then free will will have a difficult time here. Now, the problem is that some of these definitions are too strong and some of them are too weak. So let's look at some of them. And let's just say that by too strong, we mean that it is begging the question. Like, it's so strong that you're almost assuming the conclusion. So there's no way that you can defend for that premise without basically proving the conclusion. So you're just assuming it. You're assuming the conclusion there. And some are too weak in a sense that they won't make that argument that you want it to work. So let's just see a couple of examples. So for too strong case would be this one that says no physical effect has a non-physical cause. And then you say at least some mental events are causes of physical events. And this is an indication of a too strong premise that you don't even need the premise 3. Because you can immediately get to the conclusion, therefore, at least some mental events are identical to physical events. But of course, because you're assuming that if you have a physical effect, you can only have physical causes. So, in other words, you're assuming there is no such a thing as mental causation. But of course, if you assume there's no such a thing as mental causation, then there's not going to be a mental causation. That's a too strong premise. That's you're begging the question. That cannot be a causal closure because we have no way to defend that first premise. We cannot just assume that there is no mental causation without reasoning. We cannot assume that this whole debate is about that, whether there is mental causation or not. We cannot assume it. We can have a principle that is too weak if we say that all physical effects have sufficient physical causes, and then at least some mental events are causes of physical events. The physical effects of mental causes are not in general causally overdetermined. This is too weak because these first 3 premises, they do not get you to premise 2 to the conclusion at 4. Because all you're asking for is sufficient physical causes. And someone who believes in free will and mental causation has no problem with that because, for example, I don't believe that humans or rational beings who have the power of free will always existed, So if you go back long enough, there's a point in time that is all physics. There's just no even living being around here. And that's purely physics. There's no rationality there. There's no mental there. So it's all physics. So that's like P1. But then if you come into the future, then these new entities come into being out of the necessity of that physical events that were happening back then. So those physical events give rise to mentals, and now mentals are causing physicals. So that's the chain that I'm showing here. P1 causing M, M causing P2. This satisfies the causal closure that we have there, that every physical event has a sufficient physical cause, because if you just go long back, you will have a sufficient physical cause P1. But that doesn't mean that M cannot cause P2, because P1 can be sufficient for M, and then M can cause P2, so we can still have mental causation. This causal closure is not strong enough to rule out mental causation. Let's see another one that's too weak. What if someone says that every time at which any physical event has a cause, it has a sufficient physical cause? So they try to block that M that was before P2. They say no. If that's the case, if this is the case, if you look at that time at which M is happening, then there's no physical cause. There's only mental. But that's not true. At every time at which physical event has a cause, it has a sufficient physical cause. And then 2 and 3. But still, this is too weak, because you still need one more assumption here to get to your conclusion, and that's there is no such a thing as simultaneous causation. That it has to be you're bringing the element of time, and that requires more assumptions here. You cannot just throw out the possibility that P1 can cause a mental event without requiring any time, because this is not physics on physics. This is physics and mental, so we don't know those psychophysical laws happening there, so we cannot really say anything. You can bring in an assumption, but the point is that this premise 1 is too weak to get you to the conclusion. It might be that the mental is connected to the physical, in a sense that changing physical instantaneously is changing the mental. So P is causing M, but then it's M that causes P2. So this satisfies the premise 1. At each point that you look at it, there is a sufficient physical cause, P1, but that causes the mental, and the mental is causing P2. So it's still possible for mental causation. So that's still too weak. Now, if someone brings in that addition constraint that I say, no, what I mean, there's no simultaneous causation. I mean, like at every time there is has a sufficient physical cause, then it becomes too strong, because now you're adding these assumptions, and you cannot really defend such a strong position, because you're saying that every time before that event P2 that we look at, there will be sufficient physical causes. But the point is that even in experiment, we don't look at every single one of them. You can get closer and closer and closer, but you can never get to it. So there's always a period between P1 and P2, and it's possible that there's a mental event happening there. Again, this is a psychophysical causation. We cannot really bring in time. We don't know how the time works there. So, I mean, it could be simultaneous. It could be even a very fast causation happening there. So again, if you want to claim that for every time, so P1, P2, you're claiming that if you go in the middle of it, there's a physical cause. And if you go in the middle of it, there's a physical. If you do that to infinite, there will always be a sufficient physical events as causes. But how do we know that? Because in our experiment, that's not what we see. All we see is that we see a physical event. If we look for its causes, we see some further physical causes. That's all we see. And that's exactly the principle that we will work with. So the idea is that not only physical causal closure doesn't have a good statement, the point is that even if we give a very, very strong principle of causal closure, it still doesn't rule out free will, as we will see right now. So we are happy to work with this principle, which is a very strong causal closure, but not too strong to beg the question. And thus every physical event contains only other physical events in its transitive causal closure. Because we believe that this is what the empirical results actually show. What we see is that when we have an event, physical event, and we ask like what caused it, we see other physical events. And then when we say, okay, what caused those, we see other physical events. And we can just keep going. We don't see mind anywhere. We don't see a person anywhere. We don't see any mental event happening. We just see one neuron firing, one chemical happening. That's all we see. And that's fine. And that's correct. So we're fine with this principle. We can say every physical event contains only other physical events in a transitive causal closure, and we want to show that free will is compatible even with this principle. There's nothing wrong with it. We can believe that this is true and yet have libertarian free will. The important point is that these physical events are not sufficient causes. That's something, again, if you bring that in, it becomes too strong. Again, we are assuming if you bring the sufficient, then we're also assuming that there cannot be any physical mental causation. Which again tracks our empirical results, because we don't really see the sufficiency of those causes. We only see a number of causes, but we can never say that these are sufficient. Like if these happen, I don't need anything else. Now, that's not something that we see that easily in our empirical results. What we do see is that we do see causes that are physical, but we can never be sure that these are sufficient for that. So that's why we keep the principle as this. Every physical event contains only other physical events in its transitive causal closure. So in other words, the chain of causation between physical events contains only physical events in the transitive causal closure. There's nothing more. And again, that's what we see in our data. So how can we explain how can we bring in free will even when this with such a strong causal closure? So again, I have to insist here that you have a correct model of the free will that we are working with here. We are claiming that the mental event of willing does not enter anywhere in our physical chain of events. Okay, so if you look in my brain and you scan, you look at the pattern and all the neural activity, nowhere will you see a gap. Nowhere will you see somewhere a mind pointing or a mind changing something. You will never see that. You will always see physics after physics after physics after physics for many years to come, right? That's the model that I'm, as a libertarian free will, I'm going to work with, right? So the claim is that these are not sufficient causes, in the sense that we will claim that even if they all happen, all of these causes happen, since they're not sufficient, it doesn't mean that the effect will necessarily happen. So if the effect happens, we still need something to be explained. We need something to explain. There is something still to be explained, because the causes were not sufficient. So if it's happening, there's something more going on. We have to explain why it happened, even though these physical causes were not sufficient. And that's where the free will comes in. Now, to understand that, we have to go to this concept of accidents. So suppose that, one moment, I have to check if everything's working correctly. Yes. So suppose that I'm walking, and when I get close to a tree, it breaks. One of the branches breaks and it falls on me at time t. We can recognize two main events that make up the event at t. So the falling of the tree on me is an event that we can look at the causal chains that make up those events. And these are physical events. And as we said, by the causal closure that we're assuming, that then there can be only called other physical events in the chain. So P, N1, N2, T, L, E1, E2, all physical. So there are two main events that make up that event. So one is my being there at T. I have to be under that tree, and the tree has to fall. Both of them have to happen at the same time for my hurting or breaking and being hurt by that tree happens, right? So every one of these events, my being there and tree falling, has its own chain of events. The tree is falling because the last night, there was a rain or something heavy hit it, and then there was a crack on it, and then there was a strong wind this morning, and you can just get that back until weeks and months before. For me, is because I was trying to get to into a store, and because of an hour ago someone told me to get something, and because of the previous day someone needed something. So we see these two chains of events. Now the point is that these two chains, they seem to just get further and further away from each other. They have their own independent causal chains going back probably to Big Bang, but I mean in close proximity of these events, they're completely distinct from each other. What's happening in the weather has nothing to do with the needs that you have for the store. So these are these two chain of almost independent chains coming together, and at that moment T, two of these events happen at the same time. You're under the tree, I'm under the tree, and the tree falls at that point. So the question that we're going to ask is, why is it that P and T are happening simultaneously? If someone says because some other events before that, like N1 and E1 or N2 and E2 are happening simultaneously, that's not really an answer. That's not what we're looking for, because we can ask the same question about that. If we have these two chains, the question is, why is it that these two chains are aligned in such a way that P and T happen at the same time? Because that's my hurting. That's when the accident happened. Now, I gave it away, but there's no reason. It was an accident. That's what we mean by an accident. By an accident, when these two, we have multiple causal chains coming together, and they all happen at the same time, leading to like a disaster or something. And then you say, oh, that was an accident, Like the moment that I got there, he came in, and at the same time this thing happened, and this mess was created, so it was an accident, Note that how would it be that if it were not an accident? Imagine that you were walking there, but then you set up, like there was a wire or something, and you tipped that wire. And that wire connected to something, to a tool, and that tool hit the tree, and the tree falls down on you. We will no longer call that an accident, because now the chains of causations, they're not completely independent. They have one common cause, and that was a wire, right? So in the proximity, you see that there is one wire that is organizing these two events together. And then we would not call that an accident, because we would say, because someone was trying to hurt you. They set up a trap there. It was not an accident. So that's the definition that we're giving for accidents, and this is going to be helpful for us, because if we look at an action that I'm doing, for example, raising my hand at time t, we can recognize many main events that make up that event at time t. The patterns of the neural activity that's happening in my brain, there's going to be a lot of neural activity happening in my brain when I'm raising my hand. And that pattern means that a lot of activity in different parts of my brain. There's also the mechanics of my body, right? The muscles, the bones, and everything are happening. And of course, each one of these components of my body, they have their own unbroken chain of transitive event causation. If you get that pattern of my brain activity and just like reverse back time, just go back and back and back, what you would see is that these events, they just will grow like a tree. There will be a tree of event, like the one event is caused by two other, and that one caused by this other, and then you go back and back and back, and then you see other external influences through your eyes, through your ears, and those influences, they will come into these chain of events, and those events will themselves have other physical events. So as you like walk backward in time, this causal tree just gets huge, because it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as you're getting more and more influences from the physical world. And the point is that as this tree gets larger and larger, this is like those two events of that tree going to the sky and you going back to that event days ago that you needed something for the store. These chains are just getting further and further away. There's no one single common thing in proximity that brings everything together, So each one has its own unbroken chain of transitive event causation. Now the question is, why all this activity simultaneously? Why is it that at that moment that I'm raising my hand, everything is happening the way that it's happening? Because remember, that's required for my raising my hand. You need that pattern in my brain for this thing to happen. If there were a different pattern, that would not be something that I'm doing. It would be something else. Like when I'm talking to you, it's a different pattern. When I'm asleep, it's a different pattern. Or the muscles, or the movements of the muscles and the joints and the position that they have, they all have to happen at the same time for me to raise my hand. Why all this activity simultaneously when we have all these unbroken chain of transitive events? Something else must be causing the fact that these chains cause the raising of my hand. In the same sense that we didn't have anything to explain the fact that the falling of the tree and your being under the tree happened at the same time. That was a fact. That was the way that this state of affairs were. That was a fact. And nothing explains that fact. Nothing causes that fact. So we say it was inexplicable. So in other words, it was random. It was an accident. So here we ask again, so is there something that causing the fact that these chains cause the raising of my hand? Because if we say that there isn't, what we're basically saying is that raising my hand was an accident. Exactly in the same way that free falling on me was an accident, because there we had this chain coming in one moment. Here we also have this chain of huge tree of causal events just concentrating on this event that's going to happen right now. That was an accident. But that doesn't make sense. Like if I start tapping my fingers in a specific pattern, is all of that accidents? Like it's just an accident that someone is playing a music and all the notes goes like that? Is the music that someone made, is that an accident that's happening in the universe? No, that's a very difficult thing to stomach. Like if we say that tree falling on me is an accident, that's fine. But if you're going to tell me that every single decision that I've made is an accident, that's a different thing. It's an accident that you're watching this thing. It's an accident, but that's going to be a very rare accident. Even for that tree, it's going to be very strange. That's like a rare accident. But telling all of this, like every time that I'm raising my arm, accident. The point is, it's not an accident. So what we're claiming is that something must be causing the fact. This is called fact causation. So in addition to event causation, we can also have fact causation. Something must be causing the fact. I will give sources in the end for reading about event causation and fact causation. So something else must be causing the fact that these chains cause the raising of my hand. And this is where our power comes into the equation. So what we're saying is, our suggestion is that it is exactly the causal power gained by volition to raise the arm that is causing the fact. So remember how was our willing works? So we have the power for will, which is a non-causal power. We manifest that spontaneously, and it's a non-causal one. So we want something, we will something, and that's a volition. And that volition, that event, itself it gives you a second order power, which is a causal power. And that causal power is supposed to affect your body. But previously we just ended like there. We just said, okay, it's a causal power, and it just needs some body with sufficient liability, with a kind of consistent liability. And if there is one, then when this causal power reaches this liable body, then they start reacting, and then the causal power is manifested, and my hand is raised, right? So that's how it works. So the idea is that the causal power that we gain by our volition to raise the arm, that event, that volition, that is exactly what causes this fact. So this explains, right? So the volition is the mental event that's causing fact causation, not event causation. Look, because if as we explained before, in terms of events, they are only in the transitive causal chains of physical events, we only have physical events. So in the chain of like neuron to neuron, there is no part where your volition comes in. It's not an event causation. Events are all physical down the way. It's the fact causation. It's the mental event that explains the fact that these events, these physical events, are happening simultaneously. Now this might sound like a strange claim, but if you look at the empirical data, it's actually a very good explanation for the way that we actually exercise our power of will. Because this causal power first explains why this kind of event happened, because as we say, if we don't have this kind of explanation, then we have to say that it's inexplicable why this chain of events happens at this time for my raising of hand, and then we have to conclude that everything that I'm doing is accident, like the way that tree fell on me, which is absurd. So we have this kind of explanation. That's very good. So it gives us that kind of explanatory power. But more interestingly, it explains why this kind of event happened. And we'll come back to that. This is very, very, very interesting for me. Even the first time that I thought about it, it's amazing. Because when you want to raise your arm, when we decide to do something, what is it that we will? We're not willing to fire a neuron or something. We're not willing a specific trajectory of my hand. What we are willing is just a kind of event to happen. We will to cause a raising of the arm. That's our willing, right? We want, what we will is to cause our arm to rise. That's it, you see, and that's a kind of event. It doesn't matter for us how our arm comes up. It doesn't matter the specific trajectory that it comes up. It doesn't matter what the specific pattern in our brain is going to do this, because the pattern is not like that. You have that many neurons firing, even if you lose one of them, then it's not going to happen. It will happen, because that's the kind of thing that we're looking at. And if you think about it, I mean, it's an obvious fact, but Isn't it strange? Like we never will like details of our actions. Our willings are always about this kind of abstract notions, like I want to eat, or I want a pizza, or I want to do this, I want to do that. It's just a just general notion, this abstract concepts that we throw around. That I want to do this, I want to do that. But the particular details, the concrete example of a concrete instance of what we willed, that's not in our control. So I cannot control exactly the trajectory of my arm going up. That's not under my control, and that's not something that I will. I mean, you might be able to get those kind of exercises, to get that under control, but that's a different issue. That you can train your will, that you can also make something else under your control. But in general, that's what we do, right? We cause a raising of the arm. We do not will a firing of a neuron. That's not what we will. So in my mind, what we're doing basically is that we're just trying to align these sequences. We don't change those sequences because we cannot change these sequences. Because of the causal closure, those sequences are not in our control. All we can do is just align them, just to make them align so they can concentrate at that moment that we want into that specific pattern so we can raise our arm. And you can think about other kinds of events that we can make happen. It's a very interesting exercise. Now, another important point here related to what I just said, we see two different kinds of causal explanation, because now my people like, okay, you're talking about this event causation, and then we have this fact causation. Do we really need like these two different kinds of explanation here? And why are we saying that they are different kinds of explanation? Well, look, we talked about two causal explanations here. One was the physical one, which had no beginning and it was distributed. We can call it N. They're like the neural events, and you can just trace back in time, and you can see they just grow and grow and grow, and then they're influenced by other things. So we have this kind of distributed, no beginning, physical causal chain. But then there is this kind of mental event, and that mental event was that spontaneous, singular, unitary decision that we made. You just make it at one moment. That's it. I want to raise my arm. That's the moment. So you see that they're clearly different. Like one of them has no beginning. It's just a tree. Everywhere you look, it just goes back and back and back in time. But this one is not a tree. It's not nothing. It just happened one singular spontaneous event, which we will call D. Now we can analyze these two different causation, and then we can realize that they are of two different kinds. Because let's suppose one of the ways that we analyze causation is by looking at counterfactuals. Like when we say that something causes something else, the way that we can interpret that in terms of counterfactual is that if the cause had not occurred, then the effect would not have occurred. So if that's the way that let's say that's the way that we're going to analyze this causal relation, then what we're saying is, when we say that N is a physical, N is one of the causal explanations, then what we're saying is that if N had not occurred, then B would not have occurred. And that's true. I mean, B would not have occurred, and B is the bodily movement that I had. But the question is, what would have happened? Like in that parallel world, in that possible world closest to our world, in which N had not occurred, we know that B would not have occurred because, the cause of B were N. But what would have happened? So the way that we analyze it, we look at the closest possible world in which N is not true. And closest in a sense that you keep everything as close as you can to the actual world, and just change as little as possible, just to make sure that N is just not N. Is something else, which is again closest thing to N that you can have. So it's the closest possible world. So if N, what was N? N was that pattern of neurological activity. So if N is a sum of a very large number of individual neural events, that set of activity, we call it N. That was the set of physical events that we are claiming is the cause of raising my arm. Now, if N is that set, then the closest possible world in which n does not happen would differ with one or two neural activity within n. So if we change remove one of those activities, which is one neural activity from the set n, then we are dealing with a different set n. It's because of the ontological category of this set of neural activity. The persistent conditions of it would rule that if we change one or two neural activity, then we are dealing with a different n, with a different set of individual neural events. So let's call that n star. So in such a world that n star is happening, n star would not lead to b, because if you remove a couple of neurons, not one, but you can remove more. The point is, it's true that the exact same thing would not happen, right? Because if you're assuming that this is like a physical system, then those 1-2 neurons, they might have very small impact, but they will have an impact. They have to have an impact. Otherwise, then why are we counting them as causes for our raising? They have to have some role to play. So if you remove them, something will still happen. It will not be the same thing as before, of course, but it would be B a star, which would be very close to raising the arm. Actually, it would be of the same kind of body activity at B. So you raise your arm. Now imagine you get that set of neural activity, remove part of it. Your arm will still come up, but it might come up shaking, or I don't know, go to a different direction. There might be some shift here or there, It will have some jerk in it. So it would be very close. It would be the same kind of activity as B, but it would not be exactly the same. It would go a little bit here and there, just a little different trajectory. But what would have happened if D did not occur? What would have happened if we had not decided to raise our arm? It was clear. If D had not occurred, B or B a star or any event of that kind would not have occurred. See, that's a very important point. I raised my arm a couple of times in this video to show a fact. But if I don't do that decision, nothing happens. It's not like that neural activity that if you say, okay, if I change that neural activity, one or two events, then still my arm will go up. But D is a singular event. It's just my willing. And I can just not will. The closest possible world in which I don't will is just, the closest possible world to this world in which I don't will is exactly the same world in which I just don't will to raise my arm. But in that world, B would not happen, B a star would not happen, nor any kind of event of that kind would have happened. So we see that N or D are clearly different because there are different kinds of causal explanation. They cannot be identical. D, our decision causes the fact that B is of a certain kind. N, our body causing that particular event B. So the neural event causes that particular event of raising, and that's why when N had not occurred, that particular event of raising would be different. We would have a different event. It would not come like this, it would come like this. That's a different event. That's a different particular event. But all of this, if I raise my arm 10 times, every single one of them is a different raising. They're not identical to each other, but they're all of the same kind. So every single raising of my arm, this particular event, every single one of them is caused by N. But the fact that this kind of event is happening, all of them same kind, raising of my arm. I'm just doing it with one decision to raise my arm. I don't care if it comes like this or like this or like this or like this. I don't care. I just wanted to raise the arm, again raise the arm, again raise the arm. These are all the same decisions. It's just raising the arm. So I'm causing the fact that those patterns are of this certain kind, of this certain simultaneity or certain pattern to cause this raising of the arm. But the individual neural activity, they make up this particular event, the exact trajectory of my arm going up. So that's why we have these different events. And that's how we see that even though we have given a very strong causal closure principle, we still have a very good place, very consistent one, and one that matches our experience very well for our libertarian free will. So I'm going to conclude our lectures on metaphysics by saying that we are simple entities constituted by our bodies, not identical with it, with the power of free will, which is a spontaneous, non-causal power. And the way that it works is that by willing, you gain a causal power, and that causal power, when is confronted with a body that has a liability, it can cause a change. It is manifested, that causal power, and the causation is not an event causation, rather is a fact causation. So that mental event causes the fact that the physical events in my body, they're aligned in such a way so the kind of events, the kind of bodily movement that I'm asking for happens. I mean, I believe if we put this as a foundation of our understanding for free will, we will be able to get very interesting information out of this. Because even, just a thought passed my mind right away, and I forgot. Let's go through this. If that's what I'm doing, I guess this was it. Maybe that's why we need a certain amount of complexity for a body to be able to be liable for free will. Because the way that our free will works is not like pushing things around. It needs chains of causal events to align them. So you need a certain amount of complexity and this kind of event causation so you can align them and create these patterns so they can produce these different kinds of activities in that body. But yeah, I mean, it's a very, very interesting way of looking at it, and yeah, I hope you can also see it the way that I do. Anyway, so this brings me to the end of our lectures. I will just give the references here, mostly metaphysics, so subjects of experience of lots of books from Lowe. I read all of them. I definitely recommend them. Very underrated. Subjects of experience, the possibilities of metaphysics, introduction to philosophy of mind. So subject of experience, philosophy of mind, these are for the person part, the willing part. The possibility of metaphysics, a survey of metaphysics, these are more fundamental stuff. The four category ontology, that's where Lowe lays down is his main four category ontology of kinds and properties and particulars and modes. Then we have personal agency, again on mental causation, more kinds of being. One before the four category ontology, again, he lays down his understanding of ontology. Forms of thought, also interesting, more abstract kind of thinking. Powers of George Molnar, I use that a lot for understanding of powers. Like there are different ways of looking at it. George Molnar doesn't use the four category ontology; he uses 2 or 3 category ontology, I remember. Open Universe Popper, Karl Popper in Open Universe, he talks about the scientific and metaphysical determinism and why determinism is not true. So I also use that in bringing the lectures for determinism. Persons and bodies, Lynn Baker, that's where I got the idea for constitution. So that's the constitution relation is something that Lowe does not agree with. So Lowe thinks that we do not have a causation, a constitution relation between the body and person, because he has a certain view on mereological principles. But Lynn Baker, he uses the constitution. I don't see why Lowe should insist on that. I guess constitution works fine. I mean, law uses embodiment as a kind of new ontological relation, but I guess constitution works fine. I talked about that a lot. It was a long time ago, but I guess you can see the videos there. Then more mental causation ontology. Sophie Gibb, following the works of Lowe, collecting them, similar stuff. Mental causation, soul body survival. Kevin Corcoran. I don't remember much about this one. Soul body survival. I guess it was also again a kind of it was a collection of different papers on dualism. Ontology, modality, and mind. Again, Sophie Gibb. Something related to mental causations and whether. Again, like everyone's trying to make sense. Sophie is again a libertarian free will, but they all try to make sense of how this kind of mental causation so the mental causation, how the mental causation works, this kind of psychophysical laws. And oops, sorry, I have to go one moment. Okay, sorry. I had a post I had to. So, where were we? Yes, ontology, modality, and mind. Yeah, I was saying that we need. I mean, everyone's thinking about this kind of mental causation, like how it's happening, and let's check if everything's working. Yeah. Everyone's interested in how the mental causation works and what's the relation basically between the physical events that are happening in our body, the kind of causal closure in the sense that we gave it, even though it's very strong, but we can sense that in our empirical science that's the understanding that you cannot find your mind or any person inside your brain. Like when you look at an event happening, you see someone raising the arm. And you can see, I mean, you can clearly understand where they're coming from. Like, imagine you're a neuroscientist. Someone raises their arm, and you see all the neural activity. You scan the brain. You see all the patterns. You look at each pattern of thought, each pattern of neural activity, even as small as you want. You can zoom in, and then you see some events, and then you can backtrack that in time. Like you ask what happened before it. And then you see other physical events. You see other chemical reactions. You see other neurons firing. And then you say, okay, what happened before that? And then you see still other neurons happening. And nowhere in that chain of events will you see a mind or a gap, somewhere that you say, oh, I don't know why this thing happened. It went this way or went that way. Why did it happen? I don't know. What tipped it this way? What tipped it that way? We don't know. No, we don't see any of that. I mean, I'm not saying that that's empirical science says right now, but we are saying that even if it says that, because that's what I'm saying, it's a little bit too strong. I mean, that's not exactly, still don't have all these kind of data, but even if we had, that's no problem. I believe we would have one day that kind of information, that you look at each event and you look at before that and you see exactly something physical. And I don't even believe in the non-random, stuff that people try to get something out of it in our brain. Like they say, there's a quantum mechanic, it's something happening in your brain, and then it's not clear, and that somehow that the mental causation comes into place. They tip toward this direction or that direction. I really don't care about that. I believe we can have just like deterministic physical laws, and we still can have our free will. Deterministic, not in the sense of like sufficient causation to get determinism, but deterministic in a sense that there's no certainty in our rules. So in that sense, there are a lot of stuff happening, and if I remember correctly, ontology, modality, and mind, these are a long time ago. She talks about that. On action, so the philosophy of action is also very important in terms of free will and the reasons for doing things. And on action, Cauldron, he talks about the volition and willing and these sort of things, and whether they're actually necessary. Because some people, instead of event causation or this kind of fact causation, they talk about agent causation as a new form of causation. But different ways of looking at it. Parts, Peter Simons, that's a classic on Mariology that I use for some of the proofs. From the ontological point of view, John Heil, that's also a very nice, realist, interesting way of looking at things. I guess he influenced Jonathan Lowe heavily. Persons and Causes, Metaphysics of Free Will, Timothy O'Connor, The Mind and Nature, C.B. Martin, that's also a very classic, important book. Individuals of Strawson, E.J. Lowe was also heavily influenced by Strawson on individuals. Peter van den Wagen, of course, his works on free will are very important. His Locke argument and in general what he thinks about what free will means. Events and their names, Jonathan Bennett, he talks about event causation, fact causation, different kinds of causation. So if you want to know more about them. The Self and His Brain, Karl Popper. Popper is one of those who thinks that there is something related to, the new physics and maybe quantum mechanics or something happening in the brain that allows for our power of will to manifest somehow. The Dappled World, Nancy Cartwright, is it's about the general scientific picture, the way that we think that science is going to explain everything, and then we will have this nice picture of everything in place. Nancy tries to kind of destroy that image, just to show that it's like this kind of patchwork that you have from these different aspects, and bringing them together is not that easy as we thought it would be. You need a very solid metaphysical foundation. Actions, Reasons, and Causal, Donald Davidson, of course. Did I get into? I guess I did. For free will, not in these lectures, but on free will videos, I talked about reasons for actions, why our decisions, even though they're not determined by other things, they're not random because they are explicable in terms of the reasons for which we do them. And actions, reasons, and causes, Donald Davidson looks into what can count as an action, what is an action, what are causes for actions, are we caused to act? I gave the examples that Davidson gives. So yeah, is that all? These are other papers. I guess almost all of them from Lowe. So the books are very good, but then you can get the details out of it in the papers. The necessity and the will in John Locke's theory of action. So what Locke thinks of in terms of necessity and will, identity, on identity conditions of artifacts, self-reference. Self-reference is how not to think of powers in determinist free will. I'm not going to go through all of them. Individuation of powers and naming and necessity. I guess that's Kripke, right? Ordinary objects possible, problem of induction, so it's an important one. I'm just trying to see if there's any important paper. The truth about counterfactuals and the essentialism of the realism, the errors of conceptualism. All right, I just hope that it was useful for you. It was a 10 lecture on metaphysics, and I believe it provides a solid foundation. And I know that sometimes I make a video and then I say, okay, I explained that in that video, but I believe that's the only way that you can actually properly address some of the problems that we have. And we will see that actually in another video on determinism that I'm going to put out soon. That is exactly because of a lack of good metaphysical understanding that we also, don't find the correct answer for example, in determinism. By the way, I hope you enjoyed it, and it's going to be useful for you. Cheers.